I'm beginning to think about whether or not I really like you. So I understand that this is a long, long courtship. Let me say a couple quick things. I've done this for a very long time. My dad was a career soldier. We were stationed in France in 1957 and 58. I became convinced by the death of the French Fourth Republic that things can happen that change everything. Between my freshman and sophomore years in high school, I thought that there were three things that I would be devoted to. I was going to originally be either a zoo director or a vertipaleontologist. But I decided that the three key things are, what does America have to do to survive? How do you communicate it to the American people so they give you permission? And if you have permission, how do you execute it so it works? It'll be 53 years this coming August that I've worked on this. I think it is at the heart of our survival as a free country. The election next year will rival the election of 1800 or 1828 or 1860 or 1932. This is a decisive moment in defining who we are as a people. On the one hand, you will have a failed radical whose vision of European socialism applied to America will be a disaster. And on the other hand, we have to have somebody who can stand on the same platform in September and October and articulate a vision of American exceptionalism, a vision of economic growth, a vision of the work ethic, a vision of national security that is fundamentally different. And it's pretty much that straightforward. If we can get our act together, we'll pick up 12 seats in the Senate, 40 seats in the House, and we'll pick up the presidency. If we can't get our act together, we won't. And the heart of getting our act together is knowing who we are, what we believe, and convincing the American people we can actually do it. I think it comes down to three large topics. The first is American exceptionalism. Who are we? The second is economic growth and jobs. And the third is national security and homeland security. The first is straightforward. I believe we are a unique nation whose founding fathers wrote a document which says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We're the only country in the history of the world that says power comes from God to each one of you personally. You are personally sovereign. And you loan power to the state. The state doesn't loan power to you. It's why our Constitution is we the people. Cliff and I did a wonderful movie called 9 Days to Change the World. It's truly, and I say this, we've done 7 movies. This movie is extraordinary. It's about Pope John Paul II going back to Poland in 1979 and the shattering of the Soviet Empire. And there's a moment where a Polish philosopher says, 3 million people have come to Victory Square in Warsaw. They're holding Mass. It's the first time in 40 years that they're happy. They lived through the Nazis, where 1 out of every 5 Poles was killed. They lived through the Soviet dictatorship. And they're standing there looking at each other, realizing there are more of us than there are of the government. And in the movie, a Polish philosopher says, it was a moment like in your Constitution, we the people. Now, it doesn't send a little chill down your back to think that it made perfect sense to a Polish philosopher to identify with the American Constitution. Because the American Constitution grows out of the Declaration of Independence. Because we, the people, tell them, the government, what their limits are. We have on the other side, perfectly fine, extraordinarily brilliant, sadly shallow, left-wing activist who has never yet become president. He's the only permanent candidate we've ever had in the White House.
Sadly shallow.
And he believes government tells us who we are. And that's what the choice will be. So first, I believe crossroads about whether or not we're going to remain Americans. And I want to be clear about this for the news media. Being an American is not a matter of random nationality. Being an American is a belief in a way of life, a belief in a constitution, a belief in a definition of our rights. Margaret Thatcher once said, we are the only country in history which is defined only by an idea. We're not defined genetically, we're not defined geographically, we're defined because we believe that we are Americans. You can come here as a first-generation American and overnight become an American. You can live here as a tenured faculty member at a weird university and never quite get it. So my first pledge to you is, if you support me and I become president, I'll become president of those who believe in America on behalf of those who want America to survive, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that Americans are in charge of America, and to the degree that that makes our elites really uncomfortable, they can go home and write memoirs about what they did before the revolution. But we are serious and determined, and we are going to change this country. Second, this will be one of the major themes of next year. Bad policies lead to bad outcomes. Why do you have a 100% increase in the cost of gasoline since Obama became president? Because he's waging more American energy. Why do you have a 60% increase in the cost of heating fuel? Because he's waging a war on American energy. When you have an American president go to Brazil, congratulate the Brazilians on exploring for energy offshore. Tell them how glad he is we had a $2 billion loan guarantee for a George Soros company in Brazil, and tell the Brazilians that he wants us to be their best customer. You don't need a second commercial. You don't have to in any way attack Barack Obama. Just package that, put it on television and say, if you believe our duty is to borrow from the Chinese to pay the Brazilians while we go broke, you have a president. When you leave your grandchildren bankrupt, spending their lifetime paying taxes to pay off the interest of Barack Obama's debt, look in the mirror because you'll see who did it. Now, I present a very different value system. I want an American energy policy. I want a tax code that creates jobs. I want to do whatever it takes for us to compete with China and India and win. And I believe we can do it. But I think it means that 2012 becomes one of the most important elections in American history. Lastly, national security and foreign policy. I don't want to be too bold, but let me simply say on foreign policy, we should have one. This is the most stunningly incompetent amateur presidency in modern time. On March 3rd, he goes on television and says, Gaddafi must go. Now, I want to set a principle for a competent presidency. You do sound professional planning before the press conference. So, I mean, watch the last 6 weeks. It's clear they don't have a clue what he meant. They didn't mean it. They didn't understand it. They're not doing it. It's embarrassing. Ronald Reagan, in 1981, trying to reassert that America could be competent after 4 years of Jimmy Carter, is briefed by the Joint Chiefs on the fact that Gaddafi has said that there's a line of death in the Gulf of Sidra, that Libya has unilaterally decided that the Gulf of Sidra is no longer international waters, it's now Libyan territorial waters, and if any American crosses the Gulf of Sidra's line, that they will be shot down. They do very careful, thorough, professional planning. You go to the Reagan Library. Sitting outside the library is an F-14. Because Ronald Reagan, when he was fully briefed, said, okay, I approve the U.S. Navy crossing the line of death for a practical reason. The idea in 1981 that a fully funded, well-capitalized American Navy was going to lose to Gaddafi was absurd. This was a totally one-sided engagement. So we crossed the line of death. Gaddafi sends out a couple of airplanes. We shoot them down. The next day, one of the great moments for the elite media, Reagan holds a press conference. Some of you will remember the story. Because it's amazing and it's simple and it said everything. The press says to him, did they wake you up when they shot the planes down? He said, oh no, we have an agreement. We shoot them down, I sleep. They shoot us down, wake me. After the Cold War ended, an American victory, by the way, something that you'll see in no elite universities. So I'm going to just repeat it because it's so fun. After the Cold War ended in an American victory, we learned that one of the two most decisive moments in getting the Soviet Union to fundamentally rethink what they were doing was shooting down those two airplanes. Because they couldn't, it's so opposite Jimmy Carter, they couldn't believe it. And my only point to you is this. We should have an American foreign policy. Not an Arab League foreign policy. Not a United Nations foreign policy. Not a randomly confused foreign policy. We should have a commander-in-chief, not a candidate-in-chief. We should be prepared to say to the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, we're going here. And those of you who don't want to go here need to retire. Because we're going here. And we should mean it. The world is dangerous, but if we work hard enough, we can be remarkably safe. We have been for 400 years the greatest beacon of hope on the planet. The challenge to us in 2012 is whether we're prepared to roll up our sleeves and remain for our children, for our grandchildren, and for generations to come. The last best hope of mankind. I believe we can. I believe it will be hard. It will be challenging. And we have to win the argument before we're going to win the vote. But I believe we can win the argument. And I believe